Okay, welcome everyone, and this is going to be a fascinating conversation. We have just finished another vaccine conversation. I don't know that it's over yet, and we are now here joined by a great panel to speak on COVID-19 vaccines in Africa. Where do we stand in the race for vaccines? The key word here is race, which tickles me because ideally there should be no race. Humanity is equal and there is no competition. The race should be to find the vaccine, research and development, and the discovery. But the race has also turned into an equity race. Who gets there first? We will be having these conversations. My name is Dr. Githinji Gitahi. I'm the Group CEO for AMREF Health Africa. I'm also the chair of the steering committee for the Africa Health Agenda International Conference. And I'm fascinated to have this conversation with people who I greatly respect in the global health space. Our roundtable speakers, which is a high-level roundtable speakers, we have Dr. Ahmed, who is the Deputy Director for Africa CDC. We have with us Seth Buckley, who is the CEO of the Vaccine Alliance, Gavi. We have with us Sumia Swaminathan. She's the Chief Scientist at World Health Organization. We have Frederick Christensen, who is the Deputy CEO for the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, CEPI. And we have Dr. Magda Robalo, High Commissioner for the Fight Against COVID-19 and former Minister of Health, Guinea-Bissau. You will notice that in this panel, we have three partners who form the COVAX facility, the COVID vaccine facility. We have the Vaccine Alliance, we have WHO, and we have CEPI. And we will be exploring the role of COVAX in ensuring equitable access to vaccines. A few housekeeping issues. Number one is you have a translation capability. Desta, I don't see the button here. And I hope that that's not, please check that because I don't see the globe down there. Yeah. So please check that out, that we have the translation and how that operates here. Secondly, I would like to mention that we have a chat and you could post your questions or your comments on the chat as we go along. And I've requested the panelists to find time as they're answering, and we'll also try as much as possible to answer your questions. Finally, this session is being recorded and is going to be streaming live on different channels. I think it might be also on some of the CNBC channels, and will also be on the platform for several days for people to watch. So welcome to this session, and we request you to keep your mics on mute so that there's no interference when our panelists who've graciously accepted to come here are actually contributing. Ladies and gentlemen, yesterday in the opening session, where we had President Uhuru Kenyatta, we had the Director of Africa CDC, John Kengasong, we had Tedros. Tedros made a remark and said, the COVAX facility has now delivered, and I could be wrong on the numbers, but I think I got that right, about 13 million doses of vaccines in 9 countries in Africa. I'm sure Seth will give us more updated information. But basically, we are talking about Africa doing very well, especially considering that the vaccine discovery was just a few months ago. But at the same time, if you look at close to probably, I don't know how many vaccines have been given now, but the last time I checked, there were more than 250 million doses that are given. They could be given to individuals, but more than 250 million doses given. And you look at what Africa has given, and the last time I checked, I think Morocco was ahead with maybe slightly above 5 million. Other countries struggling all below maybe 100,000 or so. And now people starting to pick up. Some countries have vaccinated significantly. Of course, countries in the developed world, US, Canada, UK, way ahead. We have other countries like China that are ahead in terms of population percentages. I think UAE and Israel way ahead. But Africa still remains behind. So as we ask the question on where do we stand in the race, I think this word is erroneous, but I think it's also very impactful in terms of driving this conversation. For us, it shouldn't be a race, it's become a race. So where are we in the quest for vaccinating everybody in Africa? Our target, as Africa CDC will say, Dr. Ahmed is here, is 60% of the African population. COVAX is giving a backup, a guarantee for 20% of the population. Where are we going to be? Where is the research and development? Are we thinking about the variants, what's happening about those, and how they impact our response and the vaccination program? Are we thinking around manufacturing in Africa? How does that look like? And is it, is that the biggest agenda? And how do we achieve that? So there are many questions here to discuss about research and development, innovation, approval, manufacturing and delivery. I was in an earlier session that reflected on how Africa, the continent, has participated in multiple vaccine trials, not only for COVID, but for Ebola, and others before, for Zika virus. So where are we? So that we are looking at this so-called race beyond just access to vaccines, but about also research and development, capacity, supply. And this is the conversation we want to have today. We know that there are many issues that have arisen that we'll talk about here. Equitable access, of course, there's COVAX, there's Africa Union trying to close this gap. Speed of scale is critical. And I'll probably later, ask Sumia to comment on the issue of, if we don't vaccinate fast enough, what does that mean for Africa and the variants that are coming up? And also for the world, because, it's a connected world. Issues of health systems capacity. What issues do we see in the health system capacity that actually will be a barrier to scalable rollout and fast scale for the vaccines? And how do we build? We've always had conversations with Seth and in Gavi about how do we build health systems to ensure that vaccine delivery and access to everyone is not hampered by health systems, and how do we integrate that into the UHC agenda? Because it's not just about the vaccinations, about everything and health. Then finally, how do we address the issues of acceptance that we are seeing rising? And many of you have many examples where we have seen actually hesitancy brought up recently. I must say I was flabbergasted to see a kind of a notice from a group that was calling itself the Catholic Doctors Association saying, don't take vaccines, they are not necessary. And these are, health workers. And finally, the issue of manufacturing. So we have a lot to talk about, ladies and gentlemen, and you are in the right place, in the right meeting at the right time. And this should have been happening before COVID. It's happening now, it's never too late. Now, we will also discuss, I'm sure the issue of vaccine platforms is going to come up. Which platforms? So without taking too much time, I'm sure you did not come here to listen to me. You came here to listen to a great panel, and that is what we are going to do. We are going to move straight there. My first panelist on this roundtable is going to be Dr. Ahmed Aguero. I must say that Dr. Aguero is also a colleague. We were in medical school together, undertaking different studies, but we're in medical school at the same time. And I'm really proud to celebrate him now as the Deputy Director of Africa CDC, an institution that we cannot regret Africa Union having created, because look where it's taken us now, built a big base for this response. And I'm very proud to also be a member of the governing board of Africa CDC. So I'll come to you, Dr. Aguero, with two issues here. If we have time later, we'll explore more. But for now, I want to hear from you on the situation. Africa CDC has been doing huge work on coordination of Africa member states. And you have a very good continental perspective. In fact, when I look at this, I recall as a quote from Strive Masiyiwa, who's been driving the Africa Supplies platform, medical supplies platform. And Strive said, for the first time in history, Africa has secured access to millions of vaccine doses in the middle of a health emergency. I would like to add to Strive's statement that millions of PPEs were also facilitated through the continental agenda, the AfricaNet, the President Bureau and all these. And President Kenyatta actually did reflect on this and actually thanked Africa CDC for all the work done and coordinating the President's Bureau. So I want you, Ahmed, to take us through how things stand now and take us through, the situation room, the conversations with the heads of state, with partners such as WHO, Gavi, CEPI, and others. Take us through how these conversations with ministers have been and what have you learned that we need to carry forward and what didn't work that we need to draw. And maybe in this conversation also reflect a bit on what are the challenges that you have seen. How does Africa Union, through Africa CDC, ensure the success of vaccination beyond just success of vaccines? And what guidance are we giving to member states? I know now you are currently dealing with the issue of variants and you're supporting countries to do sequencing. So is this a challenge that we can overcome so that when variants arise, we're able to recognize them and we're able to advise the world and we're able to advise the research and development community to ensure that the commodities we develop for the COVID-19 response and the investment is not affected by this variant. So over to you, Ahmed. And I know it's a long question, but I know you're also a very sharp guy. So over to you.
Yeah, being your classmate, I have to be sharp, Gitai. And thank you very much to you, Amre, for inviting Africa CDC yesterday and then today. We really feel part of a very important conversation, not just on the continent, but also globally. Let me start by a very wise, I think it was an African woman who said that if you want to go fast, you go alone. And if you want to go far, you go together. And this has been reflected so beautifully in what Africa has done during this pandemic. We learned lessons during the Ebola crisis in West Africa. And actually, I'm speaking from Monrovia in Liberia as we chase the new outbreak. Those lessons have come to play in the formation of the Africa CDC by the Africa Union, and eventually the kind of work that we've done during this pandemic. Let me start from our heads of states. They decided to come together very regularly as soon as the first case was reported in Africa, February 14th. And to date, the Bureau of Heads of States have held more than probably 18 meetings. It's unprecedented for presidents, prime ministers to come together to speak about one topic that many times anywhere in the world. And what the conversations we have in those meetings are really divided into three. First is they ask us for our technical updates, which we give. Secondly, they ask us for the key challenges that we are facing in supporting the continent, which we share. And then their wisdom comes in and they provide us with direction and resources in as far as addressing those challenges is concerned. Now, this trickles down to the next level. And that also has been done very effectively, engaging with our health ministers first, and then ministers from the different sectors, whether it is foreign affairs, transport and communication, education, environment, agriculture and animal health. We've been engaging the different sectoral ministers so that they play their role as well in the coordination, responding to that call that if we want to go far, we go together. And this brings us to the actual response that Africa CDC has been tasked to coordinate. One thing we learned from Ebola is that if we are not coordinated, then an outbreak rapidly becomes a big crisis. And we as Africa CDC have been coordinating securing of supply chain for the important commodities that we needed, ensuring that those commodities are distributed to country level, capacity building for our African member states so that they can be able to utilize the guidelines and the commodities appropriately, and then coordinating with all partners that are working in this area in Africa. We've gone one step further, what we like to call the new public health order, that Africa has learned enough. It is time to translate those lessons into actual action. And one of those actions is what you alluded to about securing supply chain, not just for vaccines, but also for therapies, for PPEs, indeed for human resource. We must make sure that Africa has all its resources appropriately positioned to be able to respond not just to this pandemic, but to any other future outbreaks. In this way, we've engaged with the private sector on the continent to look at ways of us manufacturing not just vaccines, but other commodities on the continent because if you have it within your borders, then you are less likely to be disrupted when a big thing like a pandemic comes. And that lesson we learned very painfully during this COVID-19 pandemic. We understand and appreciate that we must walk this through a number of years, but we will never be able to walk the journey unless we start. So whatever it takes to start, that is what we are focusing on now. We are not focusing on how long it will take. We are not focusing on how difficult it may become. We are focusing on how actually rewarding it will be when we start manufacturing not just vaccines, but all other commodities on the continent for our people. That way, when vaccine nationalism kicks in, we will not be so badly affected as we are affected right now. So our message to our friends, and you know, it's always say that you know your friends when you're in trouble. And this time that we are in trouble, we are actually watching very closely who our friends are. Those who are discouraging us, we are listening. Those who are encouraging us, we are listening. Those who are supporting us, we are listening. And tomorrow when there is peacetime, our market of 1.3 billion will still be here and we will protect it. So we intend to begin local manufacture with what we have as we expand and we improve the infrastructure that we have, the capacity that we have, and I am absolutely confident that within my lifetime, and I intend to live for a little while longer, within my lifetime, we will see Africa not just manufacturing vaccines, but also securing supply chains for all the other commodities that we need. The last thing I would say, in this is that Africa has the capacity to begin. Africa is manufacturing vaccines for animals for decades now. And we have that resource, we have that capacity, we can be able to tweak it and start manufacturing vaccines for human beings without too much trouble. The question will be, are we ready to put the investment down and start that journey? Our heads of states have been very clear that they are willing and they are able to ensure that it is we facilitate manufacturing on the continent, and with that kind of wisdom coming from the top of the leadership hierarchy in Africa, we will do everything we can as Africa CDC to ensure that Africa secures its manufacturing capacity for all commodities, including vaccines. We are not going to waste this particular pandemic. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ahmed, for that. I pick from you, Africa is ready to start. I think that for me is a statement from you that summarizes a lot of the work you've done and that you've said, and also gives the determination of Africa to start. So I want to then segue from, and I'll come back to you so that we can discuss some of these other areas of sequencing and everything, and I would really like to hear from you on that. But in the meantime, I would like to hear from Seth Bartley. Of course, Seth is heading Gavi at a very critical time. And, you know, Seth, your job is cut out. I'm sure when you signed the contract with the board of Gavi, you had no idea there will be a pandemic that you're responding to. Now you're here. So I would like to, and I'm sure the audience here would like to hear from you about this COVAX, which really represents solidarity, unity, and equity, and multilateralism. I want you to talk us through why it makes sense from your point of view and why Gavi and WHO and CEPI was so fast. Because if you were trying to create it now, it would be a very different picture. Why was it so important to do it when you did it? And also throw some light on the challenges you're dealing with on this front right now. Maybe if you start there, later we can talk about how you're working on protecting existing immunization programs, because that's also your day job. How do you balance this COVAX and also protecting future programs? And also another question you may answer now or later is around post the 20%. What happens? Because at the end of the day, you know, if COVID-19 becomes endemic, 20% for Gavi eligible countries will still be a long way to go. Do we now stop there, or are there plans to go beyond? So over to you, Seth.
So Guthinji, thank you for inviting me and for those questions. And let me start, because you started before with talking about UHC and the importance of supply chains. And I have to say that one of the things that's really important is we've been working together for more than 20 years to try to get systems out. And, you know, we've immunized more than 300 million children in Africa together. And we've also worked on global health security vaccines, giving them out to large swaths of the population, like yellow fever, like meningitis. And so there is a lot of experience. In fact, when early on some initial rollouts were done in the West and there was such chaos, they were actually suggesting maybe they need to go and look at some of the countries that more recently had done these types of rollouts as ways of moving forward. But let me just go back and say a couple of things about where we started. When we knew that this was going to be a pandemic, the question was, how do we make sure there's vaccines for countries that otherwise might not be able to afford them or have access? And we wanted to do that quickly. And what we had learned from swine flu is that it's not only having, you know, money and access, it's also whether vaccines are going to be made available, because they could all get bought up by wealthy countries, which is what happened then. So we started from zero. We had no money, we had no institution, and we began to work together to try to do it as quickly as possible. Lesson learned, by the way, if there was contingent financing available and we could have started, you know, without having to raise the money to buy the doses, we probably could have moved faster. But just to get to the point, we also didn't know whether we should just focus on low and lower middle income countries. And we asked the question, should we focus more globally? And to our great surprise but pleasure, 191 countries have come together as part of COVAX. And that's important in terms of engaging and getting political support, et cetera. So where are we in terms of this process? Well, you know, one, you can say it took a long time, or you can say it was quick. The first dose, which was given post-clinical trials, was in the UK. 43 days later, the first COVAX dose was injected. That was in India. Why in India? Because that was where the approval was for that particular vaccine. Day 83, the first injections were done in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. So about 2.5 months delay in terms of doing that. And in the last 10 days, we've seen 14.7 million doses delivered to 22 countries. We hope to have 35 million doses by the end of March, 140 by mid-2021, 720 million by the end of the year. Now, to your point, this covers an estimated about 28% of the population. Obviously, there's a lot of caveats on here. We have to have enough doses. We have to have the systems to deliver. You know, vaccines have to work. There can be no mishaps in manufacturing. But, you know, one of the questions is, what is that going to do to the epidemiology? And we have to keep in mind that for the future, is the goal to just go linearly up in coverage, or we don't know the duration of protection of these vaccines. Will we need booster doses? Will we need now to come back and do special boosters for variants? Will we need to change the vaccine? So there's a lot of science questions, and I'm sure Frederick and Sumya will talk about those. But the point is, we don't have a clear view. But to get to your questions about where we are in problems and issues, to put this together, there were a whole series of things that were not in place. Simple things like, what's the labeling for vaccines in a pandemic? You want labels that are common so you can use them anywhere. We had to put together indemnification and liability for these novel vaccines. We put together the first multilateral no-fault compensation scheme so that every country has its citizens protected if there are untold effects. We had to work with countries to make sure they had the supply chains, cold chain delivery systems. And so all of that has happened, and now we're in a rollout mode. And I think it's an exciting time. We've secured 2.3 billion doses. And so again, the challenge is going to be to make sure that all of those doses are manufactured and delivered. And we've been working closely with the African Vaccine Acquisition Task Team. We've been working with the African CDC. We've been working with member governments, with WHO, UNICEF, the World Bank, civil society, everybody, to try to turn this into a driving effort to do what's necessary. And I just want to finish with one last point, because what we have to want to do is to make sure that we end the acute phase of the pandemic and do what we can to control the disease. And right now, we don't know what that's going to take, because we don't fully understand the epidemiology in different regions. We don't know the role of children in transmission. We don't know outside of the traditional high-risk groups. And so this is important work that has to be done, because it's different in different parts of the world. We know that, and that information really has to be acquired locally. So let me stop there for the moment.
Wow, thank you, Seth, for that. It must have been a lot of work. You know, we've been debating in local national task forces about labeling. So I'm glad to know that this was something that has been through the thought process from the beginning. Did you say 740 million doses by end of year?
I said 720, but again, the accuracy of that's the current plan of where we are. There was one other thing I just wanted to say, I forgot to say, which is, you know, we had no idea how long it was going to take, or even if any of these vaccines would work. And we have to accept the fact that it's extraordinary. It was 326 days from the time the genetic sequence was published until the time the vaccine was approved for an emergency use. And if you think about that, we thought we were rushing in Ebola. You mentioned Ebola. It took us 5 years. The fastest vaccine before was 4 years. And so initially people were like, yeah, maybe we can accelerate 2 years, maybe 18 months. This has been extraordinary coming together of the global scientific community. And the fact that we don't have just one vaccine, that we have a handful of them already with more coming, is a really extraordinary accomplishment.
Extraordinary. And Seth, I must personally thank you for your efforts in this. Thank you very, very much. And I know, because of course you've been working in partnership with WHO and CEPI, so I'll go down to Sumia and ask Sumia to comment on this goal of WHO. Sumia is the chief scientist at WHO, and there is this goal to ensure that the 100 days of 2021 vaccination of health workers and older people is underway in all countries. That's a really critical commitment of WHO. What risks do we face if this is not? Because I'm sure we have countries here, we have civil society, we have countries, we have other policymakers in this call. What risks exist if we do not achieve that WHO goal of 100-day mark? And I'm really happy to hear the timelines that Seth has shared. We've been able to do 43 days from the first non-COVAX vaccination to the first COVAX vaccination. That's fascinating. So that's really what multilateralism and people getting together, you know, working together further can do. So maybe if you could comment on this, Sumia, and then later on I'll come to the issue of what you see Africa is dealing with when we are talking about variants arising and this vaccine rollout and the delays that are likely to happen, and what do we see between, are we likely to get more variants coming from pockets in Africa because of the delayed vaccination? But maybe you could start off with this 100-day target. Over to you, Sumia.
Sure, thank you very much, Gitinji, and a pleasure to be on this panel with you all. Let me start with the WHO's Vaccine Equity Declaration, which is Dr. Tedros's call that in the first 100 days of the year, we should have all countries vaccinating their healthcare workers. And why healthcare workers? Because that's the group that was prioritized unanimously by the SAGE prioritization group, as well as by most governments and countries around the world, as being the people you want to protect. And so what happens, you don't protect them and you don't achieve this 100-day goal? Well, the first thing is, of course, the impact on the health workers, both the physical impact as well as the impact on their morale. We've seen now videos, very moving videos of healthcare workers from Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire and other places where the first COVAX vaccines have arrived, really commending COVAX, but saying that it's not just a jab of a vaccine, it's really a shot of hope for them. And there are still many countries waiting for that shot of hope. So we know that if healthcare workers get sick, of course, they die. And in many countries in Africa, we know that there's already shortages of healthcare workers. And if they're sick and away from work, that impacts the health system. So it has impact way beyond COVID. And as you pointed out, this is not the only problem on the continent, for that matter, in many continents. Malaria hasn't gone away, TB hasn't gone away, HIV hasn't gone away. We have an Ebola outbreak happening in 2 countries on the continent. And so we have to address all of these other issues. We've seen with TB, for example, how case finding has gone down dramatically, particularly compared to last year, particularly during the lockdown period. This was also in India, it was the same observation. New cases of HIV being started on treatment have gone down. There was a period last year when there were supply chain issues for antiretrovirals. That can impact the people who are already on, millions of people who are on treatment. So I think the impact really, we have to look at the health system as a whole, at development of countries, their health indices, the achievement of the SDGs, and of course, the economy. We see day after day the impact that the economies of all our countries have taken such a big hit, pushing people further into poverty. Malnutrition is going to increase, and this in turn will have a vicious cycle impact on other diseases. Now, there's also the fact that 21 countries in Africa have case fatality rates much higher than global averages. And this is, again, probably because of the fact that in many places, we don't even have access to oxygen. This is one of the things now that the AHAIC Accelerator has taken on board, other than diagnostics, vaccines, and therapeutics. Oxygen, IV fluids can save lives. And we need to have that in every peripheral facility. So again, coming back to what can you do, by strengthening primary health care to reduce mortality. Then, we talk about, okay, so how are we addressing this? And SET has spoken about the COVAX facility. The ACT Accelerator was set up to address this issue, which we've seen in previous epidemics and pandemics. We've seen it in HIV, we've seen it in H1N1. And compared to that experience, I must say that we've made progress, because we've been able to really shorten the timeline between, the first availability in high-income countries and availability in low-income countries. But it's not enough, because we know that we need to step up vaccination programs, we need to increase the supplies. And this is where I want to go back to the remarks you made at the beginning about building African manufacturing capacity. Now, the WHO had an interesting experiment starting in 2005, which lasted for about 10 years of trying to build capacity to produce pandemic influenza vaccines across the world. And there were 14 sites that were selected in 14 countries. And I think we need to learn from that, because many of these sites were actually successful. The ones that were supported financially by governments, were able to set it up. Again, the ones where there was a private-public partnership were more successful than those where the government alone was trying to run things. And it resulted in an increased capacity globally of 700 million doses of influenza vaccine. However, when you look at sustainability, it's not such a rosy picture. Many of these facilities, have either already shut down or at risk of being shut down, because if they're small facilities, then the cost of production per unit is higher than, massive, big facilities. So that's a disadvantage, and countries will need to commit to purchasing doses from those companies. Similarly, there are other risks. If there is no demand, then the supply will automatically stop after some time. So as we think about building capacity, and particularly since we've seen the new platforms perform so well, and specifically referring to the mRNA platform and some of the viral vector platforms, which are also very easy to adapt, but they have different complexities, of course. We would like to initiate a tech transfer program involving some of these new platform technologies, which involve either academic centers or industry that has this know-how and is willing to train and build this capacity in, say, regional or sub-regional hubs. For example, in Africa, you might initially start with 2 or 3 places which are right now best suited to be the recipients of this technology. It would need investment in infrastructure, but also in, most importantly, in fact, is the know-how and the human resource and financial resources. And then we need to think about how are these going to be kept sustainable. Once the demand for COVID vaccines reduces or goes away, we can think about repurposing for other diseases. These platforms now, we should be testing them for diseases like TB, malaria, because they have proved so successful with COVID. And of course, that's a process of R&D and development, but it does open up the possibility that you could manufacture vaccines for other diseases using these facilities, so we have to think of it in a longer term sustainable approach and build a partnership. And I think the approach that, the African Union has taken is the right one, because you can't build this in every country. It's not practical at all and won't be sustainable. So we really need to look at it, I think, from a more regional perspective. I'm happy to come back later to the variants question, if you like, Gitanji. Or if you want me to go ahead and talk about that, I can.
Actually, maybe that will be, I think we can leave you, come back to that question, because there's something you've talked about tech transfer and knowledge transfer, so that we go to Frederick, so that we complete that question. Then we'll come back to variants, and I would like a comment from you and Ahmed on variants, because you're both doing work in this area. So allow me then, Sumi, and thank you very much. Really critical point. Learning from the flu vaccine, investments, looking at matching demand and supply, and also thinking about sustainability in the future. But most importantly, on the risk area, the fact that if we delay, then we have a big problem, because we are now seeing, what we are considering as lower than normal case fatality rate, but in many countries it's higher because of what you've raised of health system, suboptimal health systems. And therefore, if we realize the danger of the health systems, they need to vaccinate faster to save our people. But let me finish this issue of knowledge transfer, because Seth said something about they have commitments of 2.3 billion doses. I didn't ask him how many of those have been actually delivered as actual doses. So, and I'm sure he cannot tell us that answer, because the commitment is on one side, but commitment is not vaccine available for vaccination. Because again, we say vaccines don't save lives, the vaccination. So when we get the doses put in people's arms, this may be dependent on the capacity to manufacture, as Sumi has said, and the need to probably start to look at knowledge transfer. So, Frederick, from a coalition of epidemic preparedness and innovations, where do you see this conversation? I know there have been conversations at World Trade Organization, on the TRIPS agreement. Where do you see the role of knowledge transfers in scaling up availability of actual doses beyond just commitment? So maybe you could comment on this, Frederick.
Yeah, thank you, Gitanji, and thanks for inviting Seppi, and honored to be on this panel. So I'll come to your question on the knowledge transfer. I just wanted to start by really, building on Dr. Ahmed's comments about the incredible achievements that have been made on the continent. And I registered early on how Lesotho, started acting even before they had a single case registered, and Rwanda, on contact tracing, Nigeria on sequencing. So I think you've come a long way, and we've all come a long way, as Seth was talking to. It's amazing to be actually sitting here slightly more than 12 months after the big outbreak, and having these discussions, because we have achieved a lot, but there's still even higher expectations now for achieving even more. I think the question of transfer of knowledge transfer is absolutely central, and we're seeing it happen already, of course, in vaccine manufacturing, with particularly from partnerships between some biologics companies and the big pharma, and also not least, of course, with examples like the Serum Institute of India taking on manufacturing for Pfizer BioNTech, sorry, not Pfizer, but for AstraZeneca. And so I think that is already happening. The question, of course, in this context is what can happen on the African continent. And I think, you know, I'd like to make two comments. One is that we need to increase the volumes because scarcity is really the biggest challenge to equity. So we need more vaccines. There's no question about that, and we need more manufacturers. However, as both Cess and Sumi have spoken to, there are considerable challenges to get there, of course, in terms of all the ecosystem that needs to be in place for that to happen. So, but in a 12 to 18 months or 18 months plus, you know, it's possible to see that probably happening. But we also need more types of vaccines still. I think we need, both in terms of the variants that we will probably likely have to address. We still need more volumes of one-dose temperature-resistant vaccines, vaccines available for different subpopulations, and not least, from a CEPI point of view, who's focusing on the R&D piece, we will be launching a call for proposals to look for even more broadly acting vaccines, so that we can have vaccines that are not strain focused, but really more broadly acting on the beta coronavirus specter. So I think that's one big important piece of the future. The other is to really build on the success of COVAX so far. I mean, we can say it's again, expectations are big, and we should be moving even faster, but still, I mean, COVAX is the best and really the only game in town for having a global collaborative approach to this. And so I think, we moved early on establishing a portfolio with making some early investments in end of January last year under the motto of, speed, scale, and access. That was the focus. Had to be able to develop vaccines quickly, at scale, and secure access. So we saw early on the need for some form of global procurement mechanism, which we built into our contracts. And that was part of the initiation of what we now have with COVAX, which is a remarkable collaboration and has started to deliver, as Seth was describing. So I think if we can strengthen that and make sure that when also African governments want to, increase access or have access to even more vaccine doses, if that can be done through and with COVAX, we can, move towards having a global, transparent, and also achieve best prices, frankly, of vaccines going forward.
Thank you very much, Frederick, for that. And I know that there's a lot of conversations going on. So maybe later, if you're willing to, could give us an overview of what's going on the manufacturing angle, under the WTO and TRIPS conversations, if there's any new information. But for now, I would like to go to Magda. Dr. Magda is the High Commissioner appointed as soon as the COVID-19 came. She was appointed as a High Commissioner for the fight against COVID-19 by Africa Union. And she's also a former Minister of Health. So Dr. Magda, the question here is, when the COVID-19 was coming up, there was a lot of hope that vaccines will come and save us. But we've quickly moved from hope to hesitancy, where now communities are not sure. Now we are seeing that, we are seeing a bit of hesitancy, or else we should be seeing rapid acceptance. So maybe you could comment on how we need to build back vaccine confidence and encourage uptake. And then after that, you can talk about, what are you advising your government in Guinea-Bissau on strengthening health systems for vaccine absorption, delivery, cold chain, which many of the other people have talked about. So Magda, over to you. Why the hope to hesitancy, and how do we move back from hesitancy to hope on vaccines? Magda.
Good, thank you, for that question. Thank you for having me, and it's really a pleasure to be in this very important panel discussing a very important matter. I think the vaccine hesitancy comes along with disease denial and disease is. If I take the example of my country, we've seen the incidence levels seen in other parts of the world. So somehow there is resistance to believe that the vaccine, for which communication needs to be much clearer. Does it reduce transmission? Does it prevent disease? Does it prevent infection? So we need to come much clearer on what these first generation vaccines are about. If you remember, there was also a conspiracy theory in the early days of COVID about whether this virus came from left and right and center. So the fact that national, in the early days of existence of the vaccines was also an issue, didn't help with our population believing that this is a vaccine that we need to be ready to take the. Let's also not forget that we are going to vaccinate adults, which is absolutely a new strategy. It's a new thing for the vaccination programs. So far, we're vaccinating children. There is a whole lot of conversation that we need to have, and we need to engage communities, credible, trusted sources. What I advise government is we need to put science, facts, evidence before politics. If we go the political way, we may get things wrong. Unfortunately, around the world and the continent, somehow we have little trust in many of our politicians, and we need to make sure that we package the information in such a way that people believe that this thing, which we have been waiting for a long time, is here to prevent people to have severe disease, and as we perform better, we will be able to reduce transmission and move from the acute phase of the pandemic. I also wanted to mention the fact that it is important to work on the multilateralism of the COVAX. We need to continue working hard on the solidarity and the trust between North and South, within and among countries. We shouldn't allow the nationalism to prevail, shouldn't allow this to continue. We really need work together. I see COVAX quickly filling that gap, quickly overcoming the challenges of first days. Frederick mentioned as one of the reasons for limited access and challenge to equity, but we, whatever is our power, to not give for people not to believe that indeed the world is on the same challenge against this pandemic. Finally, let me say that Africa has a lot to learn from the polio example. Eradication faced several challenges with vaccine hesitancy, particularly in West Africa. And we have a lot of lessons to learn from there in order to be able to convince our population. Again, I would say it's the same as children to a vaccination health center, adults to come and get vaccinated. But I think we can overcome that challenge if only trusted, confident, and credible is talking about what the vaccine is all about, where is it coming from, and what is it going to make for us, tools that will be able to open to our social life that people need to go back to. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And from a government point of view, and from being in a country like Guinea-Bissau, speaking about how we have the hesitancy is not new, and you're right. We have had hesitancy for other vaccines as well. So you're very right about that. And therefore, what lessons have we learned? that we can actually apply here. It's not a new thing. I think that's a really critical point you've raised, because many people are seeing COVID hesitancy, vaccine hesitancy as a new thing in Africa. You make a very important point, it's not. Polio, even originally, when we've seen challenges on tetanus, for example, for women in productive age, where some church groups say, no, don't give it to women, young girls who are not married. So hesitancy is not new. Thank you for that point. So let me come back. I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'll ask each of us to now limit our responses to about a maximum of 3 minutes. And I'll come back to you, Dr. Ahmed, on 2 areas. There's a question which has been raised here. And the question is on whether Africa CDC is working on tech transfer and whether that program is already working. We've heard about it from Sumia, we've heard about it from Frederic. Are we working on tech transfer? And also comment on the support you're giving countries for sequencing. The question I would like to hear from Seth, as Ahmed, I would like to prepare each of you now so that we don't take too much time when we're answering, is the question here is current programs, how do we protect, and are we protecting current programs? And then what is the issue post the 20%? What's the plan post 20%? Because many of the countries are still reliant on Gavi, even for childhood vaccines. Those countries that are relying on Gavi for for childhood vaccines, what's their plan post the 20%? The question for Sumi, and I've seen one here coming on the group, is for you to comment on COVID-19 Technology Access Pool, the CTAP. It was a WHO initiative, member states supported it. Where is it now? And as you do that, comment on the variant question as well. And for Frederick, when I get back to you, I would like to hear a little more from you on the TRIPS conversation, whether there is progress on that to allow knowledge transfer and knowledge exchange and all those things. And Magda, I'll come to you and hear a little more from you on, is there may be an ethical case for manufacturing vaccines in Africa, but based on your hearing, you've been member state in WHO and AHAIC and everywhere, is there a business case? And we've had conversations on that. Do you feel there's a business case for manufacturing in Africa, and how do we approach it? So each of you, please don't take more than 3 minutes so that we can close the session, and I'll start with Ahmed. Over to you, Dr. Ahmed.
Thank you very much, Givinji. And the first question is yes, we are working on technology transfer. In fact, we have a full program on that. We started with the Africa Collaborative for Access to Diagnostics because we felt that was the place to begin. And this was pre-COVID. And we are working with several lab diagnostics manufacturers to be able to set up their plants here in Africa to make it easier to access not just the equipment, but also the test kits as well. So this was the first step that we made, and this has been accelerated during the COVID time, where we see that we really need to continue to manufacture and start manufacturing those that we are not manufacturing items on the continent. So yes, we do have a program. We intend to expand it as soon as we are done with the debate around access to vaccines. Second is the issue of pathogen genomics in general. We are supporting at least 12 laboratories in 11 countries on the continent to expand their capacity and also to use those facilities as training grounds for ensuring that the whole area of pathogen genomics becomes the new tool of surveillance, particularly for this very difficult to manage pathogens. We are supporting these institutions with equipment, with consumables, as well as linkage to companies that manufacture this equipment and consumables. That way we work sustainability into it. We are also linking these particular institutions with countries that don't have the capacity to do sequencing, so that they have access. One of their neighbors will be able to do the sequencing for them. And this way, we have been quite successful in mapping out the different variants on the continent for COVID-19, and we are using it beyond COVID, Ebola, polio, indeed, malaria. We are doing a lot of work with different pathogens so that countries can be able to use this new tool for surveillance. And we have a full Africa Pathogen Genomics initiative within our Pathogen Genomics Institute in Africa CDC that is expanding this work with different partners across the world. So we are quite on top of the game in as far as technology transfer is concerned, and expanding pathogen genomics as a tool for surveillance of different types of disease pathogens. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. And before I get to Seth, I would like to request you to go to the chat. There's someone who's asked about AVAT and the commitments that Africa Union has made on 1 billion doses, AVATT. That's Lewis David from Reuters. If you could please answer that on the chat, and if we have time, then you can verbalize it. But for now, Seth, over to you, beyond the 20%.
So as I mentioned before, the critical issue here is making sure that vaccines can be used to end the acute phase of the pandemic and then reduce chronic disease. So I've already said that we started out at 20%. We think we may get to 27, 28% right now from the volumes of vaccines we've been able to acquire. The question is going to be, should we continue to buy doses, the same doses, new variant doses, booster doses, or specific boosters for variants? So those are the science questions that sit in front of us, and it makes it very difficult to provide, to do the fundraising that's necessary and also to put together the contracts. Our assumption is, of course, that people may want to have larger number of doses, and we've already heard from the African CDC that they have put a goal out for 60% of populations. But I think the critical issue here is, what are we learning from the science, and how are we going to adapt and adjust our plans going forward? You know, is this going to be a one-time vaccine that once we get to a certain percentage, we will have controlled the infection? Will we need to provide this with boosters at a regular point, or does this become just a routine vaccine that we need to think about going forward? And those are the critical questions that we need to answer now. And it will affect which particular vaccines we are purchasing for. In our new deals, of course, we are asking for flexibility. If there are new vaccines that are going to cover new variants, you know, that those are vaccines we can swap into so that we can have the appropriate vaccines for that time. But again, we don't fully understand that. And there so far has been pretty good evidence that vaccines prevent against severe disease and death across all of the variants. But of course, as you know, there's been some studies, particularly in Southern Africa, to suggest that they may not work for mild and moderate disease. Although those studies were small, we don't know yet if that's going to be true for severe disease. And therefore, we have to certainly understand that, and if necessary, adapt our plans. So that's where we are in terms of thinking about this going forward.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Seth. So much clearer now. And thank you for the work that Gavi is doing. And of course, before I come to Frederick, let me go to Soumya about this question on CETAP, and also a quick comment on the work you're doing also on the variant studies or genomic sequencing. Over to you, Soumya.
Yes, thank you. Let me take the CETAP first, because it's related to what I said earlier about the technology transfer hub concept. And what we would like to see, of course, we have to be open to a number of different solutions to increase supply. So there are many things you can do in the short term. You know, there's a conference going on just now that CEPI and all of us were organizing on, looking at bottlenecks. You can look at voluntary licensing that some companies have done, like AstraZeneca. We want to encourage that, but the downside there is that there's no transparency around those contracts. And then the third option is to do a more well-coordinated tech transfer, and that's where the CTAP, the COVID Technology Access Pool, could play a role, because like the medicines patent pool has done for medicines in HIV and TB and hepatitis C, it can negotiate the agreements, the license, and the terms under which those licenses will be used, with the focus being on equitable access and affordable access. So that's the advantage of having that kind of, standardized, transparent contracts with all companies. So we are open to that. We're talking to companies, and we hope that it will go forward. Coming to the variants, of course, this is an issue of concern. Particularly, we've seen in Southern Africa that many countries have been very concerned with the rise of the B1351 variant, which, by the way, was picked up because South Africa has such a good genomic sequencing capacity and had a very well coordinated approach to this. So I was very glad to hear from Dr. Ahmed. The Africa Pathogen Genomics Initiative, I think, is absolutely critical going forward, not just for COVID, but for control of infectious diseases as a whole, and understanding disease epidemiology, and also preparing for future pandemics. But as of now, the fact is that the capacity is limited. And so what we would like to see is, while that capacity is being built in many countries, I mean, we know even diagnostic capacity is limited, let alone genomics, and we are underestimating, I think, quite a bit the number of infections which have actually happened in Africa. We've seen some seroprevalence studies from different countries, which are showing 20%, 25% of the population as antibodies. So there is the issue of diagnostics and of course of genomics. Now, we have put out guidance documents on how to develop that capacity, and we need to work in partnership. We also need to share the data. So we've seen GISAID, for example, as a publicly available database of sequence data, currently has about 650,000 whole genome sequences, and that's what is enabling us globally to track the evolution of variants. We've come up now with definitions of variants of interest and variants of concern. So this was a document that was produced last week. It's on our website, because mutations are going to continue to occur. That's normal. That's what you expect in RNA viruses. But when do you call something a variant of interest? When does that then get called a variant of concern? Depends on what is the impact on transmission, what's the impact on disease severity, and is there any impact on diagnostics? For example, if that particular antigen is gone, your diagnostics will not work, or if the antigen changes. And then, of course, on vaccines and therapeutics. And we've seen some early data coming out on the efficacy of both monoclonal antibodies and the vaccines on these variants. We need much more research in Africa. We need now, even as vaccines are being rolled out, to put in place studies, vaccine effectiveness studies and protocols, and the WHO is trying to provide some of these templates and core protocols that countries can use, because we are seeing the data coming out of Israel and the UK and other countries, which is really informing us about the efficacy of vaccines in preventing severe disease, even about how much asymptomatic transmission can be prevented. We need to continue this, and we need to do these studies in places like Africa, particularly as we worry about variants. But the message I would like to send about variants is that right now, we are not at the stage when countries should be thinking twice about introducing vaccines because they've detected these variants. Right now is the time to scale up vaccination using the available vaccines, because all vaccines to date have been shown to prevent severe disease, hospitalization, and death, even amongst, and there's a very recent data I saw yesterday showing that the T cell responses are preserved. Even in the case of variants, they are active, and the T cell response is what prevents severe illness. So even if it doesn't prevent infection, even if you have a lower neutralizing antibody response, your cell-mediated immune response will protect you. So I think that we need to send a clear message to people that that's the priority for now. And then finally, at the WHO, we are setting up a system for global coordination, just like influenza, that will constantly be reviewing the changes in the vaccine, in the virus, identifying variants, looking at the data that's coming out of different research studies, and then finally making recommendations on whether the vaccines need a change, when they need a change, what are the criteria, and how regulatory authorities would assess these modified vaccines. So there's a lot of work that's going on in parallel, preparing for a future scenario where this may become a big barrier to vaccination. But I don't think we're there yet. Globally, we're, the variants are not at the point where we need to start getting worried about our vaccine efficacy at this point. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Soumya, for that. And I think that's a really critical message. Scale up. Don't worry about variants for now. Let's scale up. Now, we are in the last dying minutes of this panel, so I will ask the other two panelists to just make a 1 or 2 minute comment because we have to close. So Frederick, anything you need to share on TRIPS agreements or no data yet, no information yet?
No, so I mean, from a CEPI point of view, we're not very much engaged in those discussions, just observing the fact that this is a discussion going on, and also registering that I think looking at the understandable need for making sure that one has access, and but also our focus is really on tech transfer and the fact that as Soumya was just pointing to, volume is the name of the game. I did register the comment in the chat, and of course, just to be clear, I mean, my reference to COVAX as the only game in town was really the only global and globally focused game, and as the best opportunity to achieve a global balance. There are, of course, a number of very, very important games in town, and I think the opportunity we have is to make sure that we really work very closely together towards the common aim here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So yeah, the word global is important, and COVAX definitely the efforts cannot be underestimated, and that goes along together with the other efforts of African Union and others. Thank you very much, Frederick. And finally, some quick comments from Magda. Should Africa manufacture vaccines? Is there a business case from a government point of view?
My answer is a resounding yes. I think we have been taking too long in adjusting our technology to manufacture, be it mosquito nets, be it vaccines, be it medicines. I think Africa CDC was a very ingenious idea that our heads of state had, and we have seen the difference Africa CDC is making to this pandemic. We need to move forward in a more resolute manner to put up the African Medicines Agency to function. We shouldn't have been in a situation where every country has to have its regulatory authority to certify that, yes, I need and I want to import this vaccine. We could have done it in a continental level. And I think there is a moral, business, ethical imperative for us to start producing vaccines. Look at the meningitis vaccine, the meningitis belt. We are hearing much less about meningitis outbreaks. Look at Ebola. Look at COVID now. So we have many multiple reasons to start manufacturing vaccines, medicines, mosquito nets, and many other tools that we need to combat diseases that are prevalent in our continent. So this is my final word, and I hope that the African Union will work with the countries to move forward. It's not going to be tomorrow, but we need to put our heart together in order to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fantastic panel. I must thank my panelists most sincerely. So if you have the reaction button there, you can clap for them. I just did. It's a fantastic panel and very key messages that have come out. And of course, Magda, you heard what Ahmed said. We are ready to start. And you're basically saying the same here. We are ready to start. I think my final comment is never waste a crisis. COVAX, Africa CDC was born out of the crisis of Ebola. That's when the pressure really accelerated for it to be born. COVAX has been born out of the crisis of COVID-19, and it's not going to go away. The mechanism put together by COVAX will not die with COVID. It's going to be existing into the future. Now the question is, can we take this crisis and it become the turning point for creating an enabling environment, common market, medical regulatory environment to enable local manufacturing, not only of COVID vaccines, all vaccines, but all medical commodities. To all our panelists, thank you. To all the people who are here, thank you very much. The Africa Health Agenda International Conference continues tomorrow at 2 p.m. and a closing ceremony after. Thank you all and bye-bye. Be safe.
Thank you.
Gitinji, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good job, Gitinji. Bye-bye.
Thank you.